Speaking of which...
Speaking of which...
Speaking of which, I'm starving.
Speaking of which, you left your cell phone here.
Speaking of which, are any of you misfits hungry?
Speaking of which, you know how I got these scars?
Speaking of which, fugitive, where are you leading us to?
You'll see.
Speaking of which, you're fired.
Speaking of which, duty calls.
Oh, speaking of which, you want me to bring you anything from home when I come visit?
Speaking of which, have you seen him, Doctor?
Speaking of which, when are you gonna give up your evil ways and settle down?
Speaking of which, get out of here!
Okay.
Hey, speaking of which, is Mom still there?
Yeah, she's talking to the doctor now.
Speaking of which, I've been dying to ask you a question.
Speaking of which, do you want some mutton and coconut milk?
No.
Speaking of which, are you nailing Orson like we discussed?
That is none of your business.
Speaking of which, what about Lily? Have you thought about how you want to break the news to her?
I'm not sure.
I need a lot of loosely moral women to throw themselves at me. Hard.
Speaking of which.
Oh, you're a god, sir.
Speaking of which,